Okay. Let's see, hold on. Questions in the chat. Test cumulative or just each unit? They're by unit until the end, of course. There's always a little bit of crossover, but generally they go in order. Okay. I assume everybody can see that question in the chat. All right, so let me go ahead and start with, because you do have an FRQ, and I had a question about the free response question, and it does go in the major grade column to the best of my knowledge, so that's what it's listed as. One thing that you all should know about Canvas, and I'm sorry, KVS this summer, is that you won't have grades posted to Hack at all. So there won't be anything in Home Access Center. It'll all be in Canvas. And at the end of the course, there'll be one average entered in as one other grade, one average in for your minor grade, and of course your major grade, which is the most important. So the FRQ that's assigned will be in the mix of major grade credit. And even though it's only 10 points, that'll obviously be averaged to a percentage. So just so you know about that. Speaking of that, this is from the materials that I sent out. This is from the FRQ guide, page 5. And I got another question here. Hang on. In Federalist 10, Madison wants a government ruled by a small group of people since it's less vulnerable to corruption, but I don't see how a small group can be corrupted more. That's not true, actually. Okay, I'll address the question here in a second. Okay, let me finish my thought here. Okay, this can y'all see this screen? Again, React, if you can see it, concept application, do's and don'ts. Okay, so this is page 5 from this FRQ packet, which you were sent out in the email, not part of the official Canvas course. Again, this is just extra stuff that I think you'll find helpful. So here's a little do's and don'ts, because you do have a concept application question, and without giving too much away, it does concern federalism. In each of these questions, you have basically 3 tasks. You have a very simple task. Do you understand the basic concept? Okay. And then you have in the context of the scenario. So the most important thing in these questions is referencing the scenario. So that basically means, you know, just restating some of the facts in the question stem as a part of your response. Okay. Not as your response, but as a part of it. And then the last part of it is the most important part. C on these types of questions is where you really display full course knowledge. And so it's a little difficult in these first few of them, but I think the question is not too difficult. Okay, I have a question. I'm going to read the question and I'm not sure what your question is. Actually, you said you meant factionalism. In Federalist 10, Madison wants a government ruled by a small group of people. That's not true. That's Brutus 1. Okay, we'll address those in due time. So I'm going to hold off on that question because we are going to get into that. Okay, this is the course outline that I'm working off of, and again, this is you know, the modules in your what you guys see. You should be. I'm just going to go through those real quick for this unit. Okay. You've got Federalist 10, Brutus 1, the expansion of power. We're going to get into Marbury or McCulloch versus Maryland. Federalist 51, and then the topic of federalism, which gets into some somewhat detailed stuff that we'll have to talk about. Okay, so let's jump right in and talk about Federalist 10. Okay, this is the Federalist Papers. And you can read it. It's challenging. There's a couple of things. There's one paragraph that I will point out that I particularly want to emphasize. And by the way, Madison defines what he's talking about. That's a good writing practice that you guys should all try to emulate. Okay. So by faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion, adverse to the rights of others. Okay, so basically what he's talking about is political disagreement. In a free country, there's going to be political disagreement. It's a given. So you can cure the mischief of faction, which is the tendency of people to disagree, by removing its causes. So how do you do that? You take away freedom. or instill the same passions and the same interests in everybody else, which basically means indoctrination. Okay, in a free country, Madison argues you don't do that. So I love this line right here. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an element without which it instantly expires. So you can take, it would be no less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life because it imparts to fire its destructive agency. Yeah, you could get rid of fire just by getting rid of oxygen, but then everybody dies. So it's, he's saying the same thing about liberty. In a free country, you're going to have faction. You're going to have people that disagree policy-wise that are at odds with each other. Okay, so let me pause the screen share for a minute and be dramatic. I decided you guys could look at this flag background instead of my bedroom. Okay, Federalist 10 is probably the single most important document that you need to know for this course, just because it is the most common subject of the argumentative essay. Okay, it's because it's very versatile. Okay, so let me be clear. And by the way, I need reaction from time to time. Everybody hear me still? You can still hear me? Okay. Do the little thumbs up. Yes. Okay. All right. Okay. Here's why. Okay. Madison, first of all, no one had ever tried to create a country based on freedom before. No one had ever done that. Okay, and I think in your materials, there's some information about that. You know, people believe monarchies were necessary because otherwise people would, you know, be fighting all the time. Well, so if you start a country, if you base a country, the founding of the country on liberty, you're going to have problems, namely that people are going to disagree. So how do you resolve those problems? Madison's big thing is he believes that in a large republic, you have a variety of interests represented. And by the way, that's pluralism. Okay. And you have frequent elections. You have regularly recurring elections where the people can choose who leads them from a lot of different parts of the country. So the genius of the Constitution was it accommodated large states by giving them a lot of representatives in the House, but it also accommodated small states by giving them, you know, equal representation in the Senate, and you got to work together to get stuff done. So Madison, you know, you can see in these first paragraphs, he's not trying to, you know, mitigate. There's no way to get rid of faction in a free country. Now, if you don't care about freedom, then sure. But, and there's countries that do that. And by the way, not to get off on a tangent, but when you see the behavior of some of our big corporate entities that have zero tolerance for dissent, you know, social media, stuff like that, really makes you wonder because, you know, people are supposed to disagree, you know, not everybody agrees with everything. And so, but we live in a system where we're so polarized now that it makes it really tough to get stuff done. And so people get frustrated. Anyway, this is an ideal. It's not, you know, it's obviously our government's not perfect, but this is what our country was based upon, Federalist 10. Okay. Let's talk about Brutus 1. And by the way, I have a nice little summation of this stuff if you want to cheat and go back. This is in page 39 of the comprehensive review outline, which was also sent out in that email. So let's go through this because it's kind of condensed here and easy to understand. Okay, so Federalist 10, faction is inevitable but controllable by a large republic. Okay. And one of the things that's noteworthy about Federalist 10, by the way, is Madison expressly argues against what he called pure democracy. In other words, if you let a society run itself by majority rule and you don't accommodate the minority, you're going to end up in a lot of trouble because that underclass that's constantly being marginalized is going to eventually rise up and cause trouble. So how does a republic cure that? You have elections. You allow people to change course. Okay, look at our past elections. Okay, going back to the, I don't know, Reagan. Okay, we have Ronald Reagan and then George Bush. Maybe this is a history lesson for you. I don't know. Then we have Bill Clinton. Okay, and Bill Clinton is, you know, Democrat. And then we have George W. Bush, a Republican. Then we have Barack Obama. And then we have Trump. And then we have Biden. And back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So what that means is no party ever has an opportunity to just run rapshot and implement their agenda without consequence, because there's another election always around the corner. And that's what Madison believed would work. And, to some extent, I think he was correct, even though we're not perfect. So here's what he says about a republic. A republic would be large enough to accommodate diverse and growing population, induce greater competition among those seeking elected office, make it difficult for a majority faction to emerge. Brutus I, on the other hand, and Brutus I is kind of a challenge. It's actually a pretty easy read. It's just lengthy. So if you go to Brutus I, which I think was written by Robert Yates, these people like to stay anonymous for some reason. I don't know why, but it's 15 out of order. Here's Brutus I. And by the way, the symbolism, Brutus, the one who killed Caesar, the tyrant, very important to think of that imagery. Brutus I was specifically, to use a term of your generation, triggered by two features of the Constitution. Okay. And he talks about this in paragraph 8. He talks about something called the necessary and proper clause. And here it is. This government is Robert Yates said, this government is just absolute and uncontrollable power, legislative. Am I sharing the screen? No, for God's sakes. You guys got to tell me. Okay. I've been blathering on, and let me show you what I've been looking at. Okay. So here's the information on page 39 in the review. This is the comprehensive review outline. Okay. And then this is from the required reading packet. Okay. So again, I put mine all together in one PDF file. I think it's a lot easier to deal with. Okay. So here he is in paragraph 8, talking about absolute uncontrollable power. And if you look at the Constitution, here's the Constitution. Here's Article 1, Section 8. Remember what I said about Article 1, Section 8 is a cheat sheet for what was wrong with the Articles of Confederation. So here's what Congress can do. They can collect taxes, they can borrow money, they can regulate interstate commerce. But at the end, they have this right here, which is called the necessary and proper clause. Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Now, if you're someone who's, and by the way, let's be clear about one thing, okay? In Brutus I, we call the Anti-Federalist Papers. Anti-Federalist Papers. They were arguing that if the Constitution was adopted, it would be a disaster. Because, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Let me go through and show you what he believed. Brutus I, this is a summation, just cut to the chase. All right, national government in a large republic will become all-powerful and corrupt. Members of Congress will act out of self-interest at the expense of the national interest. Okay, so he was especially concerned about the necessary and proper clause and the supremacy clause. The supremacy clause is Article 6 to the Constitution, which says this Constitution and the laws made in pursuance thereof shall be the supreme law of the land. Okay. And with the necessary and proper clause to make all laws which are necessary and proper, and the supremacy clause, what happens to the states? So that's the real concern, is that state power is going to be marginalized under this Constitution. Okay. Now, that would be a nice little segue to talk about McCulloch versus Maryland, but we're not quite ready to do that yet. But let's go through the rest of the bullet points for Brutus I. Okay. Brutus I totally disagreed about a large republic. Brutus I was they believed in a small republic. Why? Because in a large republic, the country's simply too big. People aren't going to know each other's regional differences are too vast. In a small republic, you're going to know the people that you elect, or but going to be more likely to. It's going to have commonalities in terms of what their interests are. Okay. In other words, for lack of a better explanation, Brutus I was arguing that the whole concept of the United States would never work. So here's the little comparison. And again, you can look at this. It's on page 40 of this resource I gave you guys. In Federalist 10, Madison claims that a republic over a large territory is best suited to protect the rights of the people. Brutus 1 claims it cannot last as the government of a free people. In other words, inevitably, government would encroach upon liberties and freedom would be destroyed because of a corrupt government. So that's kind of the gist of Brutus 1. Okay, Federalist 10, Madison says a large republic will attract men of high character to run. Brutus believes the opposite. It's more cynical view that only wealthy people will seek office who are likely to enrich themselves. Certainly some truth to that, I think, in the real world. Madison claims that local interests will be met in the federal system. So not only is Madison arguing for republicanism, very important detail, he's also arguing for federalism. Federalism, as you should know, is the division of power between a national government, which has its own distinct powers, and state and local governments, which have their own distinct powers. Okay, and what Brutus believed was that they were trying to marginalize local and state governments and consolidate power in the national government. Now, we've certainly seen that. I think these are arguments that Robert Yates, the guy that wrote this Brutus 1 thing, was pretty on the money, because we have a bureaucracy today that is just, I mean, look at how COVID was handled. We get conflicting messages coming out of the CDC. One day wear a mask, next day, you're good. And of course the states are there, trying to navigate through, federal and state policies. Okay. Let's go back to the main outline and move on. Any questions about Brutus 1 or Federalist 10? Very important to understand the differences. No questions. Okay. Did that answer your question about Federalist 10? Okay, good deal. All right, let's go back to the outline. This is all right. So a lot of stuff deviates from the way it's presented. Let me go to the modules. Okay, expansion of federalist power. I haven't. Let me take a look at this. What does this look like here? Did you guys able to watch the video? Okay, let's go ahead and talk about that. I'm going to go ahead and just cover the cases that are required, because I think that's the next thing anyway. So, okay, here we go. McCulloch versus Maryland. And by the way, the other reason to look at this resource that I gave you guys is it has really, really excellent case summaries. It has very succinct explanations of the background. It has really, really good description of the facts, the issues, and all the relevant stuff. So let's jump right in. Okay, McCulloch versus Maryland. Okay, what was the main, you guys can actually respond in the chat, okay? What was the main concern of the Anti-Federalists? Type it in the chat. On the count of three, ready? 1, 2, 3, go. Okay, one participant. All right, is it Ishan? Too strong government power. Yes. Okay, they were worried about an overpowering federal government. Thank you for your responses. Okay. And what was the one clause that the author of Brutus 1 pointed out that was especially triggering? The necessary and proper clause. Okay, so McCulloch versus Maryland. Okay, here's the first major case that we study in this course. Okay, look at the date, 1819. Okay, so this is 30 years into the country's existence. So Congress created a bank. Okay, there's only one problem with that. If you look at the list of powers of Congress, you will not find the power to create a bank. You'll find borrowing money, coining money, subject of bankruptcies, but you don't find the power to create a bank. Okay, everybody with me so far? So Congress created a bank. The state of Maryland decided to tax the banknotes issued by this bank. Okay, so you can read the facts for yourself. I'll give you the short version here. Okay, so the question that was asked, does Congress have the authority to create a bank? And if so, is Maryland able to tax that bank in some fashion? Or is that prohibited because of the supremacy clause? So right off the bat, and I don't know if Robert Yates was alive at this point, but I'm guessing if he was, he would be like, I told you it was going to happen. Because here's what the court said. The court said, yeah, they can create a bank. It's here's how it works. Okay. So the Constitution. It is necessary and proper to create a bank for the purpose of coining money and regulating its value. What is our national bank today, by the way? It's not Bank of America. It is the Federal Reserve. And if you haven't taken economics yet, you'll learn all about the Fed, okay? And how it can manipulate interest rates and, selling bonds and whatever they do. Okay. So we have a national bank. Okay. So the court says, can they create a bank? Yes, they can. Why? Because it's necessary and proper to create a bank to carry out their duty to coin money and regulate its value and borrow money and all that stuff. Okay. Okay. So let's go to the second question. Does Maryland have the authority to tax the bank? Well, the court basically says this is a supremacy clause thing. Okay. Supreme Court determined that Congress did have the power under the Constitution to create a bank. This is what we call an implied power. Write that down if you're taking notes. An implied power. That's why it's called the elastic clause. It stretches, my hands are disappearing. It stretches the meaning of the Constitution, okay? The court also ruled that Maryland could not tax the bank. One of the quotes in this case, the power to tax is the power to destroy. The purpose of the tax is not to raise revenue, it's to discourage the bank. So they're trying to tax it out of existence. That's impermissible because of the supremacy clause. So what's the supremacy clause? Take a look. Here's article. By the way, you should be adept at navigating the Constitution. It's pretty important. Article 6, Section 2, this Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof shall be the supreme law of the land. And judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. So basically, if the federal government exercises power, the states don't have that power anymore. Okay, so do you see why the author of Brutus 1 would be freaking out over this? Because this is exactly what they feared. And by the way, think of all the things that our government regulates today, okay? They regulate, go to the grocery store. Find an item that the federal government doesn't regulate. You can't. They regulate our food supply, products that we sell, the cars that we drive in, the airwaves for broadcasting. Okay. And by the way, we're going to talk, there's a bunch of different ways implied powers are exercised. Okay. There's what's called fiscal policy, which is using taxing and spending. Okay. So the government wants to stimulate the economy. That's fiscal policy using the taxing and spending power. If they want to regulate, we have the Commerce Clause. Okay. Make sure I'm covering what I'm supposed to here. Whoa. Here we look at that. That might have been the actual test. No, I just lost my modules. Hang on one second. Okay. So, sorry if I'm babbling on here. Okay, here we go. Okay. So let's talk about US v. Lopez. Okay. Think of, you know what bookends are? I don't know if your generation knows what bookends are. If you have books on a shelf, they're weighted devices or weighted, it can be, sometimes you get a geode and split it in half and one half goes on one side. Anyway, the beginning and an end, think of it that way. So the beginning of implied powers was McCulloch versus Maryland. US v. Lopez. Okay, let's talk about this case. This is a really interesting case. United States versus Lopez was a case that involved a law passed by the federal government called the Gun-Free School Zones Act. Okay. Now we're new to federalism, but let me just ask you, even in the state of Texas, do you really think in 1995 kids could bring guns to school under Texas law? Do they need a federal law to pile on and say, yeah, you can't do it either? Yeah, I like the no. Yeah. There, of course, there's a law. Kids can't bring guns to school. That would be terrifying. Some people want teachers to have guns, which I think would, probably be a lot less late work, just kidding. Okay. So here's the thing. This is a federal law. Now, the question that you need to ask to understand this case is, what power is Congress using? This whole concept, by the way, is expansion of power. So from 1819 to 1995, as you can imagine, the federal government has taken on all kinds of regulatory powers. And the Commerce Clause is the most commonly referenced clause because to regulate interstate commerce, what is commerce? I mean, commerce is almost anything you can think of. Okay. Anything that's bought or sold. And if it crosses state lines, which almost all manufactured goods do, Congress can regulate it. So here, Congress is trying to regulate guns in school zones. And because it affects commerce, right? And if you're like, well, how does that relate to commerce? Well, it doesn't, says the court. Okay. Does Congress have the power to pass the Gun-Free School Zones Act? Well, they have Article 1, Section 8, that Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce. They have the necessary and proper clause. And by the way, there's a whole slew of cases on this subject about, federal state power and to what extent the federal government can do stuff using implied powers, a whole bunch of cases. Okay. And really the court was reluctant to allow Congress to regulate until the railroad era and most significantly after the New Deal. So if you remember from your US history classes, after the Great Depression, all these things were done to fix the Great Depression and all that, relying on the Commerce Clause. And here, and basically the thing is, Congress has got so flippant, they're just like, well, can we regulate this? Sure, it's commerce. Okay, so can we regulate guns in school? Of course, it's commerce. How? Look at these arguments. This is okay. I'm showing my bias here. I think the states got this one. Okay, I think states can regulate whether kids carry guns in school because they already do that. Okay, but here's what Congress was arguing. Congress has the authority to pass the Gun-Free School Zones Act under the Commerce Clause. And there's previous cases, and you can look up these cases if you want. Heart of Atlanta Motel is probably the most important one. If you've studied your U.S. history thoroughly, people challenged the Civil Rights Act when it was passed. They said, I want to be racist. I want to keep people out of my hotel. And so they said, you don't have the power. And the Supreme Court said, you're a hotel. You cater to people from out of state. We can make you not discriminate because that's interstate commerce by definition. And so, so Congress had gotten used to getting their way with all of this stuff. And here now we're like, okay, although possession in the school zone, of a gun in a school zone is not a direct form of interstate commerce, it can be classified as commerce because of the costs associated with violent crime. The presence of guns near schools negatively affects students' ability to learn, which will impede their future success and thus affect the economy. So you see, the kids are going to be so scared of the guns that they're going to do bad in school, and then the economy suffers. And that's how it regulates commerce. And the Supreme Court basically said, no, it's just no. It was a 5-4 ruling. Okay, so let me pause the screen share for a second and kind of talk to you guys directly. Okay, so this case is not a screeching halt to the power of Congress to regulate under the Commerce Clause. I call it a little tap on the brakes, okay? It says, okay, you know what? There's limits to what Congress can do. So what do you need to know for the exam? On the one hand, McCulloch versus Maryland started the ball rolling towards increasing government power. It was the worst fear of the anti-federalists realized. And in fact, its federal government did take on massive, massive responsibilities that are probably beyond the thought of the founders. But US v. Lopez put a little road, speed bump in that. and said, look, sometimes the states get to do stuff. Let's talk about, by the way, the 10th Amendment. Okay. Because we talked about the Supremacy Clause. Under the Supremacy Clause, any law that Congress passes takes away authority from the states to a certain extent. Under the 10th Amendment, if Congress doesn't act, then the states can regulate it. So case in point, casino gambling. Okay, that's kind of the go-to example with that. Okay, I thought it was to ensure, what are we talking about here? I thought it was to ensure domestic tranquility. That's basically, why not claim the ability to ensure domestic tranquility for the gun law? Okay, you're misunderstanding how this stuff works. Okay, so let me clarify. Don't conflate. Let me back up and say one thing that's very important here. Okay, Congress has to have constitutional authority for everything it does. Okay, there has to be a specific constitutional clause. The preamble is insufficient. The powers of Congress are in Article 1, Section 8. That's the source of powers. Okay. So the fact that the goal of the Constitution is to ensure domestic tranquility, that doesn't mean they get to do anything they want. Okay. It has to be within those confined powers. And that's why the elastic clause is such a big deal, because it dramatically expands the scope of things that Congress can regulate. Does that make sense? Can I get a reaction? Thumbs up, thumbs down, still confused. Okay, good deal. All right. There's a lot of stuff to go through. You know, this is usually about week 4 of the course, you know, we're here on like what, day 3 or something. So, you know, there's a lot of stuff to take in, but this is by the way, this ought to be taught along with the Congress unit, in my opinion. You ought to have a working understanding of Congress before we get into this stuff, but you know, I didn't design the course. So let me repeat and restate just to be crystal clear. Okay. Congress has to have constitutional authority for everything it does. If Congress goes outside of that authority, that is said to be unconstitutional. Okay. So when Congress tries to justify their ability to regulate something which is normally handled by the state, let me give you an example. Okay. You go murder someone. Who's coming after you? The feds or local police? Did you guys hear about this break-in at Katie Mills Mall? My son was there and almost walked him. It was terrifying. He's fine. Who was on the scene? Feds and black helicopters? No, it's local cops. Okay. Law enforcement, education, road construction, those are things that are handled by the states. The federal government gets involved with things like consumer product safety. Okay. You know, the FDA, what do? Food and Drug Administration. All right. The COVID response, federal response. How do you think these shots are being paid for? Magic money? It's the federal government. Okay. So, and sometimes the states need help. And by the way, not to give it away, but there's a little bit of crossover in that for the FRQ that you're going to be doing. So just think about that. What, you know, how does federalism come into play with a situation like that? Okay. Well, we have a federal agency, the CDC, the FDA, and together they can make policy recommendations. And, you know, to the extent that they, I don't know if they're good policy recommendations, but they can make them. And then the people, you know, the states abide by them. Okay. So let me kind of wrap this up because I think I've gone through most everything. Oh, one major thing we need to talk about. Bear with me 1 second. Okay. Oh, by the way, the advantages of federalism. Okay. Sometimes the states have better ideas than the federal government. Sometimes the states are better at stuff. Okay. Now, one issue that's come up in your generation, in your lifetime is the complete change in policy towards drugs, specifically marijuana policy. Okay. In federalism, we talk about something called the laboratories of democracy. Every state has the ability to make policies, and if they're good policies, other states will emulate them. And if they're really good policies, they might change federal law, or, you know, federal law may adapt. So what was the policy of the 90s? Draconian drug enforcement. 3 strikes and you're out. You get caught with weed one time, slap on the wrist. You get caught another time, maybe go to jail for the night. You get caught a third time, life in prison. Okay, now I'm not supposed to editorialize, but I'm going to. That's a terrible policy. Okay, that's a terrible policy. You're going to clog up the jails. You're going to cause animosity among the police, all this stuff. So what did the federal government do? They loosened up enforcement. They said, California wants to do medical marijuana. Okay, let's see how it works. And then Oregon's like, yeah, we want to just make it all completely legal. Okay, well, let's see how that works. And then pretty soon all these other states, even Texas is thinking about, you know, maybe a change at some point, you know, who knows, but probably not anytime soon. But you know, so if it works, then maybe adopt it nationally. So that's one of the big things. Okay. The other things that we got to, I'm going to jump to this screen share over here because first of all, I want to show you it. And also it's, I had it all figured out and now it's, here we go. Okay. Review topic 6, 10th Amendment is a counterbalance of federal power. I probably want to read that. I kind of already went over that, so I'm not going to go through it again. But make sure you read that. It's a good one. This one is going to be very helpful. Okay. Fiscal federalism. Write this definition down. Fiscal federalism is when the federal government or Congress uses the powers of taxing and spending to try to manipulate the economy. Money is every state needs it. Every state wants it. Okay. States are willing to do things to get money. Case in point, the federal school lunch program. No school district in America wants to pay for that all by themselves. So they get money from the feds. What does the Fed want? What does the federal government want in response? Well, they want nutrition standards. Now, this came about in 2010. It was called the Healthy, Hunger-Free Kids Act, passed under Obama. And Barack Obama was, his wife got all the blame for it. It's the reason you can't get, heaping mounds of French fries and, sugary drinks and all that stuff. They took all that stuff away. Why? Because they wanted to have healthier kids. Okay. They wanted fewer, if you're less likely to be obese as a child, you're less likely to be obese as an adult. That's the thinking. How do they get the states to do those programs? Well, that's what we call a categorical grant. There's 2 types of grants you need to know. Well, a few more than that. There's 2 main topics. Categorical grants are grants of money flowing from the federal government to the states, where the states have to do very specific things to get the money. So what do the states have to do? They have to implement a menu that complies with the FDA guidelines. By the way, if you haven't figured it out, when Congress passes a law like the Healthy, Hunger-Free Kids Act, they depend on a government agency, a bureaucratic agency, to carry out the law. So they say, okay, FDA, here's the new standards. You figure them out, and then here's how federalism works. At the local level, state governments and even school districts are like, okay, Monday is, chicken nuggets. We'll, bake them, not fry them, I guess, to comply. So they're the ones at the micro level making the menus. Okay. But all to comply. And if they fail to comply, if they don't give you a piece of fruit, for example, that's a violation. And if they get caught often enough, that money can go away. Another categorical grant program is special education. And by the way, that includes gifted and talented, part of special ed. Okay. So there's different types of categorical grants. There's called a project grant, formula grants. Project grants are exactly what it sounds like. It's, some grant of money for a specific purpose, maybe a research grant or something like that. Let's talk about block grants. Block grants are funds that are given to the states where they have more discretion. Flexibility, not carte blanche, do whatever you want. That was an outdated policy, by the way. I hope you're taking notes, called revenue sharing. Revenue sharing was a kind of situation where states would get money from the federal government and they could just spend it however they wanted to. Okay. Block grants are different. The most common block grant given to the states is for transportation, road construction. Okay. Just as an example, I always use it for here in Houston area. What do you think the snow removal budget is in Houston, Texas? We actually needed it this past year. The snow removal budget for Houston, Texas. I'm going with $0. Okay, maybe they got, maybe they got $100,000 for salt in the case it ices. I don't know, but compared to Michigan, Iowa, New York, states where it snows heavily, they're going to have a lot of need for that. So who better to make policy, the bureaucrats at the federal level or state level? State level. So that's where block grants come in handy, because the federal government can still give money to the states to get them to do stuff. Okay, like, you ever gone out of your lane on a highway? You hear this because that's a federal policy. The federal, every state in the union has to put those little divots to keep people from falling asleep on the road. That's a federal policy. Okay. Now, the money to do that comes in form of a block grant. So block grants states like, because they get more discretion in how to spend it. Okay. Devolution. Let's talk about devolution, returning power to the states. Sometimes programs are administered using a categorical grant. One example of that historically was welfare. In the old days, welfare used to have actual food. Let's see if we can find a food stamp. Very dangerous live Googling on a, okay. Here's food stamps. Okay. In the old days, they had physical food stamps. You could go to the store with them and they operated just like cash. Okay. I worked at a grocery store when I was young, and I remember seeing people come in with, $15, $20, $50 worth of food stamps. They'd buy $20 worth of groceries and get $30 cash, and then they go buy cigarettes and alcohol. Well, that's not really what the grant is for. So when the government figured this out in the 80s and 90s, they basically started, okay, states, you got a better idea. State of Michigan in particular had an idea. Texas started with the Lone Star card, and the control over how to spend the money was given back to the states. In other words, categorical grants were converted into block grants. And that's an example of devolution. Okay. So anytime you give power back to the states, that's devolution. Okay. I am imagining that you're either sound asleep or ready for some questions at this time. So can I get a camera turn on just for a split second here? Oh, there was one. Okay. So let's see who I'm talking to. All right. Any questions now that I can actually see you guys? Has this been helpful? Okay. I don't know what the guy on YouTube keeps saying, but I've been through this stuff quite a bit, and I think I did look at the exam again. I think it covered most of the stuff that you need to know. So, okay, if there's no other questions, I guess we'll call it. And if you want to stick around for a second, I'll leave my stuff on for a few minutes. But otherwise, I'm going to stop what we're doing, and maybe let me see one last thing. Hold on. Oh, okay. I will tell you one thing. Okay. There is a question type that is a comparison question, a multiple choice comparison question. Is the textbook still important? Yeah, I would say so. Not as much on this unit. I would say you can probably rely a little bit more on my materials on this unit, but still read the textbook for now. There's just a few little things here and there. And I know for a fact that they're using the textbook test bank in part. Okay, so that's a reason to look at the textbook. One question type, real quick. It'll have a comparison chart. Okay, you have two columns, a left column and a right column. look very carefully at wording. Interstate commerce is different than intra-state commerce. Okay. And when you see a correct response on the left column, then is when you look at the right column. I don't know if I'm making any sense or not, but I can't share the screen because it's actually the test. But so you know, use process of elimination. Look at the one column first until you get something that's correct, and then look at the other column. Otherwise, wasting your time. Okay, I don't know if that helped or not. And then one last look at the outline. Is there anything I forgot? I think that's pretty much it. Okay, so you guys are free to log off at this time, and we'll see you next time. And if you have a question, I'll stick around.
Do we need to know like the significance of the documents, or like should we like have a few quotes ready or any part of the document specifically?
For what?
Just like for FRQs or anything?
You know, in a virtual course where you potentially have the document in front of you, you're going to drive yourself crazy with that. So I would know the big picture. I would literally go to my materials and look. In fact, I'm going to share the screen with you so you can see it real quick. If you go to this comprehensive review outline, if you go to the very end of it, and this is going to sound bad, but it's kind of true. All right. Go to the quick reference reading right before you take it. Okay. Articles of Confederation, weak decentralized government. Federalist 10, large republic will help cure faction. Okay. Federalist 51, checks and balances are important. I forgot to mention that in the meeting. Oops. Federalist 70. We don't get into that, but you get the idea. That way, because and hopefully, if you actually read it, it'll at least trigger your mind so that you can remember it. But at this point, you can't confuse the if you start arguing about Federalist 10, Madison believed in a small republic. That's not true, and you'll get it wrong. Okay, so use the quick reference guide. I think it'll be helpful. And then if you need more depth, go to the review topics. And then if you need more depth, go to the textbook. Okay.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Anyone else?
Mr. Stone, like in the chat, I put like it was an assignment about it was like how do what like federal revenue sharing like meet societal change. Like I was confused, like what do they mean by that?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
I think it was like questions for unit 1.2 minor grade. On that, it had like 4 terms, and it'd be like, how does federal revenue sharing meet societal change?
I don't know why they keep asking about that. That's revenue sharing hasn't been around since like the 80s. Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe they're, I'm screen sharing. Is this the question? Distribution power.
Number 5.
Distribution power between federal and state governments changes to meet the needs of society. The changes are reflecting. Explain how each of the following meets societal changes and provide current day specific examples. Okay. I'm going to get in trouble here, but this is not the way funds are distributed anymore. Okay. There's no, I think it's, you can look it up. This is not something that is really taught that much, and I'm not sure why, but
yeah.
So mandates.
Like wasn't.
Oh, I should have talked about that too. Like the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Okay, that's a federal mandate. Okay, and sometimes the federal government has to take action because the states aren't. Okay, so if you've got 50 different standards on, handicapped access to buildings, that's a real problem. So in the 90s, they took action and they said to the states, you got to make buildings accessible to handicapped people. You got to make sidewalks accessible. And by the way, you got to pay for it. That's an unfunded mandate, by the way. So that, how does it meet societal change? Well, we believe as a nation in equality. It's not equal, when a handicapped person doesn't have access to a building, but someone who is not handicapped does, so that's why that was allowed. Okay. So I don't know if that makes sense. Give me 1 second. Let me look something up real quick and see if I can help you more with that. Okay. All right. I think the way I would look at California versus Wyoming. Okay. California has a massive amount of revenue that they take in. Wyoming does not. Okay. So revenue sharing would kind of level the playing field a little bit by allowing smaller states to have access to some of the resources that they otherwise wouldn't have, because you're pooling all of this tax money and distributing it back to the states based on some formula, perhaps. And again, most federal programs are not done that way anymore. There's specific, strings attached and things like that. So, but anyway, I wouldn't worry too much about that. I'm certainly not going to scrutinize it.
Okay. Also, like one more question
But
on the
I will
same
say
side.
one thing about revenue sharing, though, is that the reason it's no longer utilized is because the states, once they get the money, they can spend it however they want to. And that might help you on one of the exam questions, because that's why it's lost favor, because the federal government wants to control how it's spent.
Right.
Okay. What was your question?
And then one more question. It was how like separation of powers and checks and balances allows for multiple access points. It's like question number 2.
Oh,
They like
dang, I should have talked about that.
like
Okay.
the videos like talked about it, but like he just stated that like it has multiple access points, but didn't state like how it had
Okay.
multiple, like how the people.
Okay. Let me talk about that. The idea of multiple access points. Okay. Let's take a policy. All right. And sometimes, you got to talk about policies that at one time at least were controversial. Okay. Same-sex marriage. Okay. In the 80s, no one talked about that because it was taboo. Okay. The 90s, you started to see more acceptance. Now it's like, go ahead and get married. Who cares? There wasn't a single member of Congress. Maybe there were some. Most people in Congress avoid those controversial issues. There's too controversial. They don't want to take the heat for it. Okay. So Congress as an access point for same-sex marriage legislation is cut off. Okay. What's another access point? State level. Okay. So that happened. States passed same-sex marriage laws. Some states had it, some states didn't. Okay. That's an access point. What's an access point to get that policy at the federal level? The courts. You talk about equality. You make it an equal rights issue. And that is, in fact, how that happens. So in federalism, there are gazillions of access points, at the school board level, local level, even community HOAs, state legislatures, state court systems, federal legislature. Okay. Even appealing to the president himself on Twitter or something like that. That's potentially an access point. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds really confusing, but describe how the separation of powers and checks and balances allow for multiple access points. Okay. There's 3 branches of government. That's 3 entry doors to policymaking. Okay. I forgot one, by the way, the bureaucracy. Okay. During the Obama administration, he wanted climate change legislation. He had Republicans in power for most of his presidency. They were like, no. So what's an access point? Let's see, what agency might be involved with the environment? The EPA, that's an access point. So Obama didn't even try to work with Congress. He goes to the EPA, says, we need some climate change rules and, blah, blah, blah. So they do a study, they find out, hey, CO2 is bad for the environment or whatever. So then they make a policy, and all these coal plants shut down because they can't meet the emission standards. And just like that, policies changed. What was the access point? The bureaucratic agencies. Okay. So make it easier to understand.
Yeah, that makes way more sense. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good day.
You too.